like this.
Yep. Yep.
Yes, okay, perfect. Quick pointer check also works. Yes, so thank you very much. We all now know a bit more about go-arounds. And I find it actually very interesting because our numbers show very similar situation. We also studied 2019, but we look at the specific case of go-arounds and vessel traffic. And you might think, how? Why? Yeah, I see some questioning faces, and that's completely legitimate because I didn't believe it myself either. But at Hamburg, from our office window, we can see the Airbus airport. And for those of you that know Hamburg, we have the Elbe, and Airbus is very close to the Elbe. So actually, there's vessel traffic passing very, very close to the Airbus runway. But I'll show you a map. There. So as you can see, this is the runway, and this is the Elbe. And we have container ships from all over the world arriving at Hamburg Harbor. It's one of the main harbors in Europe. Of course, we cannot compare to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, please. But yeah, and we saw it from our window. There was a go-around, and it was due to a vessel passing. And this was unbelievable. So we decided, okay, let's analyze this, right? Like, close to home is a nice place to start. We found that the rate of go-arounds at the Finkenwerder airport, the Airbus airport, was 3%. And previously we've seen the average is 10 times smaller. And then we were like, okay, well, there is something going on here. And we found that, first of all, this 3% is for all Open Skynet data, so not only 2019, but then we also focused on the year 2019. And we found that the rates are actually very different between the southwest approach, that doesn't cross the Elbe, and the northeast approach, that does cross the Elbe. So we looked further. And first of all, I want to give you an idea of what we could see from our window. Yes, I got the mouse.
313 Alpha, can you approach traffic right to left, 100 right of the approach line? I think you can park behind. Avoid forward flying, which is 300 degrees forward from it to 350. Don't overfly the ship, just that, just that. Very good, that's right, you want to Alpha climb all around there, take 5,000 feet.
Yes, we had the same reaction. Seriously? We have to go around because a ship is passing? Aren't vessels very slow and super predictable? So we looked a little bit further. Okay, that doesn't work. So we contacted the DLR institutes that are having to do with marine traffic, and we asked them, like, hey, we know that there is the same concept as we have for ADSB, also for marine traffic. Could you give some to us? And this is the AIS data. As you can see in this table, very comparable. We have an identifier, we have a location. Vessels don't really care about altitude because, well, they're on the sea. But what is interesting is that these messages also contain static information about the vessel. So unlike us, who have to go onto the aircraft database of the Open Skynet, in AIS, this data is included in every single message. And this includes the width, the length, the type of a vessel, a tugboat, a tanker, a container ship, name it, and the name of the vessel, because they always have very cute names. And unfortunately, this does not include the height, which is our main concern. But as you can envision, I mean, if I have a white vessel, it can carry a lot of weight. The actual height that we are concerned about are the containers. So it must correlate, it must have something to do. Let's look a little bit further. So then, first step, we have to identify these go-arounds. And us two, we started with Junji-san's tool of the flight phases identification. We then find anomalous phase transitions, as were identified before. It is in descent, it is at a low altitude, but it goes back up, or either it starts leveling and goes back up afterwards. And finally, yes, sorry. So flight phases, we're all mostly familiar with them. We didn't really look at the taxi phase. Climb, level, cruise, descent. If we're in descent, we look further. Descent to level, descent to climb, level to climb. These are the cases where a go-around can occur if we are already at the second half of the flight, so not in the initial climb or in the climb, and if the altitude is low enough. Then we look at what happens in the next 60 seconds. Is the rate of climb relatively high? Is the phase climb also high? After this, we also did a manual inspection. We still found a few test flights. So what I forgot to tell you is we looked at the airlines that go to the Airbus airport, because of course this airport also has a lot of test flights. We still found a few of them, eliminated them, found a few false positives, false negatives, and corrected those too. All right, and we came to these numbers. So this table shows you the numbers that I've mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Total flights, approximately 1,000, go-arounds 34. That's a lot. Now, southwest approach, there are fewer southwest approaches than northeast. And one could say, okay, but if the vessel traffic is causing problems, why not go southwest? But I am not an aviation engineer. I don't do air traffic control. I don't know why. Wind. Good point. Thank you. We'll look into that later. Northeast approaches, the same. Northeast approaches, many more go-arounds. And also, I would like to point out, we look at least one go-around. Of course, there can be multiple go-arounds in a single flight. And when we classify by approach, we look at the first go-around that happened. Now, we looked into vessel traffic. Out of these 775 northeast approaches, 172 of them could be associated to vessel traffic during the approach phase. And out of the 31 flights with go-around, 27 could be associated to vessel traffic in the approach phase between when the aircraft started the approach and the estimated landing that I will dig in further. All right, now, okay. You rightfully mentioned, yeah, vessel traffics are definitely not the main source of go-around. Like, there's very many factors. Most of them are like inside of the aircraft during the flight. We cannot know those. We all know the problems with getting such data. But we can look at the external factors. So we consider weather and air traffic spacing, because of course, air traffic control and air traffic has to do with go-arounds. But first, we look at the vessels, AIS data. The weather, we consider wind speed, wind direction, and the runway condition. Hamburg is very rainy. This did not make a difference. And finally, we, of course, use the Open Sky Network to compare the last scene and the first scene to the estimated or real time of landing of the flight. Right. Nice box plots. Vessel traffic. So first of all, how do we identify the vessel traffic? Well, we take the approach, we look, so by altitude, we look, okay, when does the aircraft have the heading off the runway, and when does it reach the runway in terms of latitude and longitude coordinates. And then we estimate the same thing by using the other flights that did not have a go-around for the go-around flight. So we take the point of go-around, this moment where the descent turned into climb, and we look what other flights were nearby and how long did it take them to actually reach the runway. And from this we get an estimate of the potential time of landing. And then we look for AIS data during that time. For each flight, we will get a set of vessels. And of these, we select the largest one, because, of course, the largest one will be the one that can cause problems. We compare their length and width. Again, height, unfortunately, not available. And we find this plot. OK, that was wrong. There. As you can see here, the dimensions seem different. Of course, there can be still large vessels where there's no go-around. We do not exclude that. We also don't know if every large vessel was actually having the containers on top of it or not. But we can clearly see a difference. And so we correlated using point Bézériel correlation, for those of you that are statisticians, to see, OK, how does the width and the length of the vessel correlate to the occurrence of a go-around? And there's a pretty moderate correlation there, definitely significant. So as we can see, it's approximately 0.6 correlation for both the width and the length. All right, now let's take these same flights, these 170 flights where we could find vessel traffic, and look at the other factors. The weather conditions. As you can see here, a same time frame. Actually, we used the time of the landing to identify the weather conditions. And as you can see, they don't seem very different to each other. And the correlation also does not show much. For wind direction, we first look, of course, at the difference of distributions. If that shows a difference, then we would move on to performing a correlation. This is not straightforward for wind direction because, of course, the 360 and the 1 are not, should be close to each other but are not in a linear correlation. However, since the distributions didn't even seem different, we just thought, OK, probably not it. All right. Now, air traffic spacing. This becomes a little bit more interesting because, as I mentioned, we use the OpenSkyNet metadata of the flight, so the first scene and the last scene compared to the potential or real time of landing of the flight. And again, we take the values for 2019. We compute the differences between time of landing and first scene of vessels. Let me get it right. That first scene of vessels that departed from Finkenwerder, or last scene of vessels that landed at Finkenwerder. And we find these values. You can clearly see here, all right, the nearest last scene, definitely different distribution. That's true. However, this median lies still at 12 minutes. And the smallest, that's 6 minutes. So, all right, we can say maybe some flights, maybe some go-arounds were having to do with the first and last scene. Of course, also these values are not always indicative of when the flight actually landed, ground coverage, other factors. However, also reducing the distance to the airport didn't change the statistic. So only looking for flights that were identified as landing in Finkenwerder, and the distance to Finkenwerder was 100 meters, that did not make a difference. All right, so here everything in comparison. Again, we can see vessels, 0.6 correlation, nearest last scene, 0.3 correlation. Let's look a step further. We've estimated the time of potential landing for these go-around flights, and now we wanted to see, OK, where are these vessels that we've identified that we say these are the largest vessels, these might be the problematic ones, where are they during our estimations? So we take the minimum and maximum estimation. Again, this came from other flights that had no go-around and how long it took them from the point of decision for go-around to the runway. And we can see, OK, there are definitely some vessels. There's actually one way out there as well. However, a large group of vessels are right in front of the runway. So maybe we are onto something. Then we continue looking. OK, we said the AIS data includes the type of vessels. can we see there something too? And the answer is yes. I mean, many of these largest vessels, in the case of a go-around, are indeed carriers, container ships, and so forth. The vessels that you would typically think of as a large vessel. Now, for the non-go-around, we find passenger vessels. And if I go one slide back, here you can see that there are several lines crossing as well the runway path. This is because in Hamburg, of course, to cross the Elbe, we also use ferries, and the ferries happen to bring the Airbus employees directly to Airbus or other ways to the south and north. And these are sometimes identified as ferry, however, often identified as passenger vessel. Now, why did we not exclude them? Because a cruise ship is also a passenger vessel, and it can get pretty large. So now, next step, fine. Vessel traffic can be a problem for go-arounds, but what do we do next? Well, of course, there's very many accurate ways to predict vessel trajectories. There's people that do that, but we started with a very simple approach just for a proof of concept. So we want to predict the time it takes the vessel to reach the runway. This is the prediction time. And we set different values, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Then we sample the speed of the vessel in a sampling time before that. And we take the median. We use the median to calculate, okay, so now we know the location, we know the distance to the runway. How long will our estimate take to reach the airport, the Airbus airport? And as you can see, these are the different estimations for the time it actually takes to reach the runway and for the different sampling times. We can see that it's often underestimated. This could be because there's a speed limit at Hamburg harbor, which means that vessels that come from the North Sea, they can need to slow down because of the speed limit as soon as they approach the harbor, which is then also on their way, where the runway is then on their way. However, we can also see that on average, a 20-minute speed sample is already pretty accurate and does not even show that many outliers. So what does that mean? We've also looked at, okay, how often do these large vessels pass? Because if that's a continuous flow of large vessels, of course, we cannot do anything. However, we found that the size that we considered, a vessel passes approximately every 22 minutes. And with our very simple estimation technique, we found the error to be 4.6 minutes, leaving still a good 10, 12 minutes for the aircraft to land safely without incurring into vessel traffic. But of course, this result can also be improved. The longer you need to predict ahead of time, the worse the error gets. That's very intuitive. And we did not want to make any conclusions on how much time it takes for air traffic control to direct the aircraft so that it can land safely. We just put some estimates that we think could be reasonable, but it's up to the more experts to identify that. And yes, that already leads me to my conclusion. So what did we find out? First of all, very high incidence of go-arounds at Finkenwerder Airport. Secondly, of all the factors that could have to do with this high go-around incidence, vessel traffic seemed a pretty big one. Next, we can predict vessels already with a very simplistic method to only take up 20% of the space between vessels, leaving 80% for a safe landing. And if we can find a way to avoid the vessel traffic, then of course we can decide to go into a holding pattern and land at a safer point in time, which I don't think I have to tell you, but could save fuel emissions, noise emissions, and of course fuel costs as well. What do we want to do? We want to look closer at the the flight maps to see where is the nearest holding pattern and how long does it take on average to go from there to Airbus Airport in Finkenwerder. And of course, we want to also look better into the prediction of vessels. How can this be improved? Talk to the other institutes at the DLR that work on this on a daily basis. As well, they also work on estimating the height of vessels. Maybe we could use this, although this mostly involves cameras, and not sure if we can install these cameras also in Hamburg. And finally, of course, nice case study, one tiny airport in Finkenwerder. But I believe that since ports and airports are often located in similar locations, that there could be other airports in the world where this might happen. And I think we'll use the new data set to investigate that.